Fellows, guests, visitors, may I extend a warm welcome to this unique event, the presentation of the 2020 Rind Lectures. My name is David Caldwell, and I am the President of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and it is my privilege to introduce this year's distinguished Rind Lecturer, Dr. Alison Sheridan. It is a custom at the Rind Lectures to begin with a brief personal memoir about Alexander Henry Rind of Sibster, who endowed this lecture series. Rind was born in 1833 in Wick, where his father was a banker. He was educated in the local academy and at Edinburgh University, where he read natural history and natural philosophy. He also attended lectures by Cosmo Innes on Scottish history and antiquities because of his strong personal interest in these subjects. He involved himself in the archaeological study of his native Caithness, and in 1851 opened a number of chamber tombs, including those at Yarrows. In 1853, he investigated the Broch at Kettleburn, a report on which appeared in Volume 1 of the Proceedings of our Society. The finds from the Broch were also presented to the Society, Rind having been elected a Fellow in 1852 and becoming an honorary member in 1857, aged only 24. His archaeological interests were far-reaching. For example, in 1851, he made an extended tour in Europe, visiting museums in the Netherlands, Denmark, Prussia, Switzerland, Austria, and Italy. And he was subsequently called upon to advise the Society on the organisation of the exhibits in the museum. Rind had intended to proceed to the Scottish Bar, but in 1853, deteriorating health led him to move to the south of England, and from then on, he only visited Sibster in the summer. Nearly every winter, he went abroad to pursue his antiquarian interests in Egypt, and in later years, spent much of the winter in Spain, Algiers, France, Italy, and Madeira. Rind was a prolific donor of both Scottish and foreign antiquities to the National Museum here in Edinburgh, including many important items he discovered in Egypt. Also in Egypt, he acquired what is now known as a Rind mathematical papyrus, which was sold after his death to the British Museum. It featured recently in Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects. Rind was himself an active writer of papers, memoranda, and letters, concerning himself, for instance, in matters of antiquities and treasure trove, on which he published influential pamphlets. In 1855, on British primeval antiquities, their present treatment and their real claims, and in 1858 on the law of treasure trove. How can it be best adapted to accomplish useful results? His magnum opus, the book on his work at Thebes in Egypt, was published in 1862, shortly before his death, with the title Thebes, Its Tombs and Their Tenants, Ancient and Present, including a record of excavations in the necropolis. Rind died at Zurich in 1863, some 23 days short of his 30th birthday, and was duly buried in the family burial ground at Wick. He left several bequests, including money to establish 2 scholarships at Edinburgh University, and another sum to found an industrial institute at Wick for orphan girls. He was especially generous to our society, gifting us his library of some 1,600 volumes, a sum of £400 for excavation in northern Scotland, and the profits and copyright of his book on Thebes. In addition, he left the eventuated residue of his estate at Sibster to the Society to endow the lecture series that still perpetuates his name. And so, Since their inception in 1876, the lectures have enabled speakers to present, and I quote, a course of not less than 6 lectures on some branch of archaeology, ethnology, ethnography, or allied topic, in order to assist in the general advancement of knowledge. So this year, our distinguished speaker is Dr. Alison Sheridan, someone who I know very well since Alison and I shared employment in the National Museums here in Edinburgh. And Alison has made a very distinguished career in the museum and internationally, and has quite rightly and justifiably received several accolades in recent years for the quality, the erudition, and importance of the work she has done and the way she's helped advance the study of prehistoric archaeology in Scotland and in a wider Europe. In the course of her impressive career, and she retired just a couple of years ago, 1 year ago. Alison retired just 1 year ago. She has been president of the Prehistoric Society between 2010 and 2014, and co-chair of the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework's Neolithic panel. Her research spans the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, Copper Age, and Bronze Age in Britain and Ireland, and she has collaborated in major international projects, including the Beaker People Project, Projet Jade, and Projet Jade II, and was principal investigator for a project studying gold in Britain's gold-bearing regions, 2450 to 800 BC. She's published widely, lectured in Europe, the USA, and China, and curated exhibitions, appeared on TV and radio. In 2018, she was awarded the British Academy's Graham Clark Medal for distinguished achievements in archaeology, in prehistoric archaeology. She got the Europa Prize in 2019 from the Prehistoric Society, and in 2020 was Current Archaeology's Archaeologist of the Year. In 2019, she was made a Fellow of the British Academy, and in 2020, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. A very distinguished person, but more so than that, a very knowledgeable, erudite, and brilliant speaker. I look forward to this course of lectures. Alison.
Mr. President, fellows, listeners around the world, I'd like to thank the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for having bestowed upon me the great honour of presenting the 140th series of Rind lectures. It's quite daunting and humbling to read through the list of distinguished previous lecturers. One gets a sense of following in the footsteps of giants. But I'm delighted to be flying the flag for female archaeologists, being only the 7th to deliver a full set of lectures. As you all know, this year's Rinds are somewhat different from all the previous ones, insofar as they're being delivered several months late and without a live audience, thanks to the dreadful pandemic that has blighted all of our lives. But I am pleased to be here, in the auditorium of the National Museum of Scotland, along with a select few people, fewer than 6 and socially distanced, who are making sure that these lectures are being professionally recorded. It feels a little bit like the first of Ant and Dec's Saturday night takeaway shows that was filmed without an audience, where the film crew in the studio had to provide as much whooping and hollering as they could muster to create a simulacrum of an audience having a fun time. I can assure those present today that that will not be required here. But you, the audience, are most welcome to hoop, holler, laugh, and take issue with me in the privacy and comfort of your own homes. And at the end of all this, at an appointed time, you can participate in a live Q&A session. There are other advantages to presenting the Rinds this way and at this late point in the year. Firstly, instead of sitting through the usual marathon of 6 lectures over a weekend, you'll be able to turn me on and off whenever you like, a privilege that's sadly not available to my long-suffering husband. And indeed, I'd encourage you to take a break, dip in and out, and have a cup of tea or something stronger, because I know it can be tiring to concentrate on your computer screen for a full hour of lecturing. Secondly, the delay of several months has meant that it's been possible to bring you the most up-to-date information on the Scottish Neolithic and its broader context. Now, for example, the first of 2 major and splendid publications of the results of fieldwork in and around the Ness of Brodgar in Orkney has just been published. And by the time these lectures are broadcast, the 2nd volume will have come out. And over the summer, we've had some spectacular results of human DNA analysis from Ireland that have a direct bearing on our story of Neolithic Scotland in ways that I shall explain in due course. These results include evidence that one man buried in the huge passage tomb at Newgrange was the child of an incestuous relationship. What I aim to do in these 6 lectures is to set out for you what we know, what we don't know, and what we need to find out about what I regard as the most fascinating period of Scotland's past. The 1500 years or so between around 4000 BC, when, as we can now say with some confidence, thanks to recently obtained DNA data, immigrants arrived from different parts of the near continent and introduced a completely new and continental way of life based on agro-pastoral farming, along with the cultural traditions, practices, and ways of making sense of the world that went along with that lifestyle. And at the other end, around 2500 BC, when we can say, again thanks to DNA, that new people from the continent arrived in parts of Scotland, introducing a totally new style of pottery, beaker pottery, and several other novelties, including metal as an entirely new technology. We call this 1500-year period the Neolithic or New Stone Age, and while some archaeologists are advocating the rejection of period terms such as Neolithic, Chalcolithic and Bronze Age in the belief that they carry too much baggage, I shall be continuing to use Neolithic as a convenient shorthand term, and I'll also be opening the suitcase and inspecting the baggage, as it were. I'm also acutely aware that there are still some archaeologists who are uncomfortable with the idea that these major changes are associated with the arrival of new people. They associate that kind of explanation with an old mode of thinking that they label culture history, and some have even resorted to accusing the proponents of the immigration model, wrongly, as wanting to go back to the bad old days when every kind of change was simplistically interpreted in terms of invasions of new people. Yes, folks, we're in academic bare-knuckle fighting territory here. The Mesolithic-Neolithic transition has been a battlefield of ideology, dogma, and theoretical fashion for several decades. And anyone who's familiar with my own work will know that I love the smell of burning straw men in the morning. So I can guarantee that this series of lectures is not going to be boring. In this first lecture, I shall be taking stock of our current perceptions of and approaches to this period, and I'll be reviewing the panoply of scientific techniques that are currently at our disposal and are being applied. I'll introduce some of the lively debates that have arisen from the conflicting narratives that have been proposed, debates that don't just focus on the initial appearance of farming as a way of life. My second lecture will explore the various scales of inquiry, from the local to the international, that we have to adopt in order to make sense of the massive data at our disposal. I shall try to sketch out a big picture narrative of the main developments between 4000 and 2500 BC, and will also give you a sense of the regionally variable narratives that have to be developed, since it's very clear that one story does not fit the whole of Scotland. I shall be offering case studies for 2 contrasting and often overlooked regions, West and Southwest Scotland and Shetland. My third lecture, An Everyday Story of Country Folk, will take a close look at Scotland's inhabitants during this period. I'll be focusing on farming as the predominant subsistence strategy, exploring what it actually entailed, seeing how it varied over the wide range of environments in Scotland and how it changed over time. I'll also be looking at where and how people lived and what we can say about the changing nature of social organisation. And what about the people themselves? How long did they live? What illnesses did they suffer? How did they relate to each other? And how did they define themselves and others in terms of their identities? I shall conclude that the story of Neolithic country folk and their beliefs and practices was anything but everyday and humdrum. The fourth lecture sets out to make sense of the dizzying array of funerary monuments that loom large among the visible traces of Scotland's Neolithic. It will explore this diversity, drawing out the regional and chronological trends that are now becoming clear, thanks to the growing body of radiocarbon dates at our disposal. It will also try to situate these monuments within the broader range of funerary practices that are evident, and will also look at the beliefs about death, the dead, and the ancestors that underpin these actions. By understanding these, we get closer to understanding how Neolithic people made sense of the world. My fifth lecture, not just a load of old balls, deals with the fascinating and currently controversial period between around 3200 BC and 2800 BC, when we witness a specific trajectory of change, social change in Orkney, that was to have far-reaching consequences elsewhere, both within Scotland and much further afield. This was a time of the invention and spread of grooved ware pottery and of various practices that were associated with its use, of the creation of entirely new forms of structure and monument, and of the manufacture of a weird and wonderful array of symbols of power, including, of course, carved stone balls. I shall try to unpick the many and complex threads of this story, a story that takes us to Ireland and beyond, and which speaks of a deliberate attempt to create a new world order by some ambitious cowboys. I shall also be making a point that this was not the only narrative to be told. This series of lectures will conclude by considering what happened thereafter and what impact was made by the arrival around 2500 BC in parts of Scotland, as well as elsewhere in Britain and Ireland, of immigrants from the continent, the so-called Beaker people. Did the arrival of these funny foreigners with their funny foreign ways sound the death knell for a Neolithic way of life, whatever that had been? Was it related to the apparent collapse of the social system in Orkney, or to some more widespread crisis, as a recent teleprogram might have us believe? Or is the story much more complicated and nuanced than that? You'll have to wait and see. We'll end by considering what our research priorities should be in order better to understand the Scottish Neolithic and its place in the world. But let's go back to the beginning. I suspect that our benefactor, Alexander Henry Rind, would have been very interested in the topic of these lectures, given his evident fascination with the chambered cairns of Caithness, where he grew up. Rind excavated 4 such cairns over the summer of 1853, around the Loch of Yarrows, largely in the hope of securing some tolerable specimens of human skulls for comparative anthropological study by the craniologists Davis and Thurnham, who were compiling their Crania Britannica publication at the time. In this, however, Rind was to be disappointed. One poorly preserved skull fragment from one cairn had degraded to the consistency of a gelatinous pulp, while local vandals had smashed into 50 pieces another, hitherto better preserved skull that had been turfed out of another tomb by treasure hunters. Rind published the results of his careful excavations in Volume 2 of the Ulster Journal of Archaeology, choosing to publish in Ireland rather than in Scotland in order to draw attention to what he saw as the close similarity in chamber design with the huge passage tomb of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley in Ireland. Whether or not he was correct, and in my view he was not, we should be returning to the topic of Scottish-Irish links in a later lecture. While ill health prevented Rind from carrying out his plan to excavate other chambered cairns nearby, his generous bequest to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for further archaeological research in Caithness, Sutherland and Ross-shire after his untimely death in 1863 meant that his work could be continued by Robert Innes Shearer, who had assisted Rind in his fieldwork and who had himself started excavating the cairn at South Yarrow South in 1864, in anticipation of a visit by the President of the Anthropological Society of London, along with Joseph Anderson, who at that time was the editor of the John O'Groats Journal, but who went on to become the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland in 1869. Shearer proceeded to investigate 8 chambered cairns in Caithness in 1865 and explored a 9th, following up in 1866 with the excavation of a further 3 and the exploration of a 4th. Even though Anderson and Shearer were meticulous in recording and publishing their findings, sadly their excavation techniques were not up to today's standards, as Anderson himself admitted in 1886, 20 years later, when he wrote, "I was then a novice in the art of cairn exploration, and like all novices, I thought only of the readiest method of cracking the nut to get at the kernel. In accordance with the usual opinion and practice, I cracked the nut and found that it contained no kernel, or, in other words, that it had no relics that could be exhibited in a glass case." Sadly, the human remains that Anderson and Shearer excavated from all these monuments did not make it into any museum. Rind's understanding of how old these monuments were was typical of its time. In a letter written in 1854, he opined that, "I certainly am disposed at present to regard the cairns as somewhat older than the Picts' houses," by which he meant Arne's Brochs, "but not much so. There is a degree of similarity in the method in which they have both been built that marks them as being nearly synchronous." Rind wasn't to know that, in fact, the chambered cairns predate the Brochs by about 3.5 millennia, as you can see from this set of radiocarbon dates obtained from human remains from northeast Scottish chambered cairns. And incidentally, if you are curious to see just how the design and engineering of these two very different types of structure actually compare, I recommend that you take a look at John Barber's series of Rind lectures from 2018, which are available online. Over the 157 years since Rind's death, the transformation in our understanding of and our approaches to the Scottish Neolithic has been so complete that Rind would have found it simply unimaginable. And indeed, as we shall see, many of the advances in our methods of analysis are producing results that would have seemed incredible to us just 10 or 15 years ago. It's worth spending some time taking stock of the panoply of techniques that are currently available to us and that are being applied to just about every aspect of Scotland's Neolithic. These are generating a vast amount of data that can actually be challenging to track down and to synthesize, and they certainly generate a lot of debate. It's also important to acknowledge the huge contribution that has been made and continues to be made by the research projects that apply these techniques, and by developer-funded fieldwork that reveals many welcome surprises. And over the course of the last decade, or so, there has been a sea change in our approaches to researching and sharing information about the Scottish Neolithic and other periods of Scotland's past as well. Archaeology, from being a pastime of wealthy antiquaries as it was in Rind's day, is now being practiced with the principles of social inclusion, accessibility, and imbrication within the nation's economic and social well-being taking centre stage. These are the values that run through Scotland's archaeology strategy. And just to give you a snapshot of the range of these public-facing activities as they relate to the Scottish Neolithic, the current Scottish Rock Art project, which, as its name suggests, is recording rock art in Scotland, is being done as a community-based initiative, training teams of local people to create photogrammetric models of decorated rock surfaces. Archaeology Scotland's Adopt a Monument scheme has succeeded in restoring and conserving an important passage tomb at Carnglass on the Black Isle. The Dig It initiative, led by the irrepressible Jeff Sanders and featuring its own YouTube channel, is engaging young people by making archaeology funky and fun. And Kenny Brophy and Gavin McGregor's annual Build and Burn community project on Arran, where a timber circle like the late Neolithic examples at Machrimore is constructed and burnt down, has been a roaring success, boom, boom, and has contributed to the tourism branding of Arran. Sorry, I couldn't resist the puns. Moreover, The super talented Matt Ritchie of Forestry and Land Scotland has been busy producing superb teaching resources about Scotland's past, starting with 2 books about the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. In a curious twist of fate, the Mesolithic man, on the left, bears an uncanny resemblance to the 2018 Rind lecturer, John Barber, and the Neolithic woman on the right looks quite a bit like the Neolithic specialist Dr. Seren Griffiths, although clearly this is just coincidental. So, the Scottish Neolithic is clearly not being regarded as some dry, dusty and boring period in the distant past. It has a vibrant presence in people's consciousness, and, as we are witnessing from the worldwide fascination with Nick Card's excavations at the spectacular site of Nessa Brodgar on Orkney, Scottish Neolithic archaeology is making a significant and measurable contribution to Scotland's economy through heritage tourism. So, going back to the main theme of this lecture, let's start our review of the archaeological toolkit with chronology, one of the fundamental building blocks for our understanding of the Neolithic period. The advent of radiocarbon dating in the 1950s has been hailed by Professor Christian Christiansen as the second revolution in archaeology, the first being the establishment of the discipline around a century earlier. Radiocarbon dating, along with tree ring dating, has become one of the staple techniques of archaeology, and has enabled us to say that the period that we label as the Scottish Neolithic belongs essentially to the 4th and the first half of the 3rd millennia BC, spanning around 1500 years. That's quite a bit different from Stuart Piggott's pre-radiocarbon estimate of 500 or fewer years, starting around 2000 BC, that he published in 1954, and it's worlds away from Rind's vague idea of the time of the Picts, which he saw as being sometime after the primeval past, but before the Vikings. Correct. Thanks to improvements in the radiocarbon dating techniques, including a brand new calibration program, IntCal 20, and to a more rigorous approach to sample selection, we now have the luxury of more accurate and generally more precise dates than ever before. And thanks to the increasingly routine use of Bayesian modelling as a way of dealing with the inevitable statistical scatter produced by the dating process, we can start to produce fine-grained narratives at the level of individual generations, although it has to be said there's still a good way to go on that front. A good example of this approach is offered by the recent The Times of Their Lives dating project on late Neolithic Orkney, led by Professors Alastair Whittle and Alex Bayliss. This provided around 200 new radiocarbon dates pertaining to key sites including Barnhouse, Poole and Nessa Brodgar, and it modelled over 500 dates relating to the Orcadian Neolithic overall. Here, for example, on the left, you can see the modelled date for the arrival of the genetically distinctive Orkney vole, the significance of which will be explained in Lecture 5. And here on the right is the overall schematic model that the Times of Their Lives project proposed for various aspects of the Orcadian Neolithic. Let's turn now to our methods of surveying and recording and go back to the chambered cairns for a moment. The magisterial Scotland-wide survey of these monuments that the great Audrey Henschel undertook in the 1960s and 70s, and again between the 1980s and the noughties, along with the late James Davidson and Graham Ritchie of the then-named Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, RCAMS for short, produced a step change in our understanding of these monuments, their distribution and their contents. Their surveying and recording was undertaken using equipment that now seems basic, but it was done with care and skill, and it stands the test of time. And I'm delighted to say that Audrey is still with us, looked after with love in an Edinburgh care home. Nowadays, high-tech methods are used to take our surveying and recording of these monumental structures to a new level. For example, Historic Environment Scotland recently commissioned my colleague, Dr. Hugo Anderson-Weimark, to create a series of 3D photogrammetric models of chamber tombs in Orkney, such as this one, the Passage Tomb at Cueen. These models take us away from the conventional 2D approach of viewing and presenting chamber tombs in plan and section, and they enable us to explore these monuments in forensic detail and in a virtual 3D kind of way, giving us a sense of how it feels to enter along a low, narrow passage into a chamber. Indeed, in these benighted COVID times, it's the closest we're going to get to entering this tomb for a while. You can manipulate and interrogate these models, which are on Sketchfab, and you can access them using the URL shown at the bottom of this slide. Laser scanning is another technique that's been used to record chamber tombs, and we'll be seeing an example of that in Lecture 4. Other survey methods have witnessed similar dramatic advances. Conventional aerial photography has been used for the best part of a century. Here's an annotated image showing the Neolithic timber enclosure and other sites at Forteviot that were recently excavated as part of the Strathern, Environs and Royal Forteviot project. The enclosure you can see at the top left of that picture. Systematic aerial photography surveying has been undertaken for several decades by teams from the formerly named ARCAMS, now Historic Environment Scotland, and large parts of Scotland have high-quality coverage. Within the last 15 years, low-altitude aerial photography using kites and drones has been added to the portfolio of archaeological recording techniques, as you can see in this kite photo of the chamber tomb at Cletraval on North Uist. And drone photography is rapidly becoming a standard part of many excavations. Within the last decade or so, the powerful technique of LiDAR, airborne laser scanning, has been used to great effect by AOC Archaeology, by Forestry and Land Scotland, by HES and others. And its advantages are clear from the 2019 HES survey of the Isle of Arran, which doubled the number of recorded sites of all periods and discovered a new and wholly unexpected Cursus monument at Tor Moor, running for just over 1 kilometre. LiDAR is a very powerful survey tool as it presents a remarkably consistent documentation of the landscape, and it can see through vegetation cover, such as woodland, as long as the trees are not too dense. And here you can see just how much of Scotland has already been covered by LiDAR survey. And in the latest development, Dave Cowley of HES, working in collaboration with others, is examining how artificial intelligence and computer vision can help us explore and interrogate such digital datasets in an automated way, thereby offering the potential for a step change in the detecting of sites. Another very important way of locating sites and revealing ancient landscapes is, of course, through geophysical survey. And an outstanding example of this is the extensive work that's been undertaken in the heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. The results, as just published in this magnificent Landscapes Revealed book, include the revelation that the Nessabrodka site is at least twice as large as the area exposed by excavations so far. Let's turn briefly now to the methods used to reconstruct the landscape, environment and climate of Neolithic Scotland. The detailed bathymetric and other underwater surveys that have been undertaken in Orkney for the Rising Tide project by Caroline Wickham-Jones and colleagues from various universities, and undertaken in the Outer Hebrides by Dr. Richard Bates and his team from St Andrews University, and more generally for Britain and Ireland by Dr. Fraser Sturt and colleagues at Southampton University, have revealed the changing shape of our landmass and outline in response to the rise in sea level following the end of the last ice age around 10,000 BC and the subsequent uneven rise in land level, a situation that has led, for example, to the partial submergence of quite a bit of the Mesolithic and early Neolithic landscape of Orkney. In the map on the left, all areas outside the green oval have lost land to sea since the end of the last ice age, and coastal areas inside the green oval have raised beaches. Moreover, detailed and increasingly sophisticated paleoenvironmental reconstruction using pollen analysis, soil micromorphology, and a veritable battery of other techniques means that it's possible to create reliable images of what the vegetation cover is likely to have been at specific places and specific times during the Neolithic period. Here, for example, you can see a reconstruction produced by the super talented Aaron Watson with a team from the University of Stirling under the guidance of Dr. Richard Tipping of the landscape around Torvlarren rock art site adjacent to Kilmartin Glen around 2400 BC. Okay, that's just into the Chalcolithic period, strictly speaking, but you can see what I mean. There's an excellent lecture by Richard Tipping that explains how they achieved this, and you can see the link to that here. The battery of other paleoenvironmental techniques that are now available includes the use of biomarkers such as coprostanols that can survive in waterlogged deposits. These chemical compounds can be used to detect areas where cattle have been penned in or where human fecal material had been deposited, and hence can be used to identify activity areas. A similarly dizzying and ever-expanding array of techniques is used along ice core analysis to reconstruct the past climate and its changes. While we don't yet have the detailed picture for Neolithic Scotland that has recently been produced by the University of Stirling's Alan Cochrane for the Northern Isles and Caithness, covering the final period of the Ice Age and the immediately succeeding millennia, nevertheless, we do have a general idea of the climate and its changes over the course of the 4th and 3rd millennia in Scotland. We can say, for example, that the mean summer temperature around 4000 BC was probably around 1.8 degrees centigrade warmer than now during the post-glacial climatic optimum, and that over the course of the Neolithic, not only was there slight cooling, there was also increasing storminess due to the shifting position of the North Atlantic jet stream, and this storminess is shown in things such as sandstorms. Moreover, it's not just past climate change that we have to consider. The impacts of current climate change, and in particular the destruction of and threats to many sites through coastal erosion from storms, are being investigated by HES and the Scape Trust, and there is a climate action plan in place. Here you can see the area on Harris where the Neolithic and Beaker period settlement site at Northton has just about been completely destroyed since its excavation in the 1960s. And in the middle, you can see the passage tomb and the later settlement at Swandrow on the coast of Rousey, which is being excavated in the teeth of continuing erosion. And on the right, you can see the iconic late Neolithic settlement of Skara Brae, where the ongoing issue of coastal erosion is being closely monitored. The whole site has been laser scanned by HES to help gauge any changes in its condition. Recording all of the threatened sites before they are lost to the sea is on the list of priorities in Scotland's archaeology strategy, but it's a mammoth task. Turning now to artefact studies, our understanding of these and other exquisite axe heads of jadeite and other alpine rocks has recently been totally transformed by a major international research project, Projet Jade, directed by the inspirational French archaeologist Pierre Pétréquin. Pierre and his wife Anne-Marie have 25 years of ethno-archaeological experience in studying the last makers of stone axe heads in New Guinea. And from that, they understood that people could go to extraordinary lengths to obtain rock from special places such as mountains, in the belief that the rock was a living, powerful substance in its own right. So, while geologists had focused on the torrent beds around the foothills of the Alps in their search for the source of the jadeite, the Pétréquins systematically prospected in the valleys of the high Alps for many years and succeeded in finding working sites at altitudes of between 1,800 and 2,400 metres above sea level, mostly around Monte Viso, above Turin, and around Monte Begua, near Genoa. And these are the magic mountains from which these green treasures come. This is on Tino Valley, below Monte Viso, and most of the working sites are right up high, up there. When you go up there, as I had the great privilege of doing in 2009, and stand with the clouds around you, it's easy to see how these mountains could have been regarded as the abode of the gods, and the precious and beautiful stone that comes from them could have been ascribed divine power. That's why it was used to make extra special axe heads. And here's what a block of jadeite looks like. The French call this a boudin, because it's shaped like a bit of like a blood pudding, so the French equivalent of haggis. The rock is very tough, and to extract a piece, people would set fire at the base of the block so that they could then strike off what is known as thermal flakes. This axe head from Garvock in Aberdeenshire retains the characteristic curved profile of such a flake. What the Projet Jade team did was to create a huge reference collection of raw material and debitage samples, and to analyse this and over 2,100 large axe heads from right across Europe non-destructively, using a technique known as reflectance spectroradiometry. It's the same technique that's used to check for water on Mars. This allowed every single axe head spectrum to be compared with that for every other item in the database. And the results are spectacular. We can say, for example, that this broken axe head, probably found near Dunfermline, had been made from the same block of jadeite from Monteviso as 3 other axe heads found in Germany. In terms of sourcing axe heads, it doesn't get any better than this. And among the many other amazing things that Projet Jade and its follow-up project Jade 2 achieved was an overall distribution map for large alpine axe heads, and indeed all the alpine axe heads in Britain and Ireland, which shows that they travelled up to 1,700 kilometres from their source areas, from Portugal in the west to Ukraine in the east, and from Caithness in the north to Tunisia in the south. Indeed, some underwent much longer journeys during their complex lives. Projet Jade also worked out the typochronology so that we can say what types of axe head were made from which materials at which times. And they've also been able to track the changing pattern of axe head travel over the millennia. As we shall see later, this systematic approach to chronology and context has allowed us to realise that many of the ones that reached Britain will have been centuries old when they got here. We'll be returning to the results of Projet Jade in later lectures, and you can read all about the project in these 4 massive volumes and in many other publications. But before leaving this topic, I just want to share one finding that's actually relevant to Alexander Henry Rind. It's also topical, given that we are recording these lectures during Black History Month. Rind presented this magnificent axe head from his collection to the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland in 1860, and its find spot was recorded as Cornwall. But during Projet Jade, it became clear that quite a few jadeite axe heads in European museums, including this example, are not from the Alps at all, but are actually Caribbean petaloid axe heads, so called because they are like the shape of a flower petal. They also tend to have distinctively conical butts. They relate to the Taino people who lived around the time of the Spanish conquest 500 years ago in the Caribbean. Such axe heads made from jadeite from the Motagua Valley of Guatemala circulated around the Caribbean, and many were subsequently found by plantation workers digging in the fields. So it seems likely that this one had been brought over to Cornwall by a sailor or by somebody connected with plantations, and over the years it had acquired an incorrect provenance as Cornwall. Its story can now be added to the resources that are being used by community-based heritage projects over in the Caribbean. If we stay with stone artefacts for a moment, I'd just like to mention Mark Edmond's wonderful recent project called Working Stone that looked at all the types of stone that we use to make tools and other objects in Orkney, from the Mesolithic to the Bronze Age. Beautifully illustrated by the busy Hugo Anderson Weimark, this helps us appreciate what lay behind the choice of particular types of stone for particular types of object in Neolithic Orkney. And, as with Projet Jade, it brings home to us the need to look away from the purely utilitarian if we want to understand what stone meant to Neolithic people. This project is a very valuable resource for future research, and it really should be emulated elsewhere in Scotland. Also, Mark's project produced a super cool top trumps card game for 2 to 6 players, ideal in these socially distanced times. Let's move on quickly to consider advances in the study of Neolithic pottery. A whole new field of analysis has been developed and applied over the past couple of decades, thanks to the work of Professor Richard Evershed and his colleagues in the University of Bristol. This is the analysis of fatty compounds called lipids that get absorbed into the body of a pot as it's used. And this doesn't just help us understand how that pot was used, it also gives us vital clues to aspects of the Neolithic diet. Moreover, in a recent development, we can now also get radiocarbon dates from the lipids, which means that we can date pots directly. Initially, lipid analysis was able to identify resins, waxes, and animal fats, and to differentiate between fats from different species of mammal and between meat fats and dairy fats. Then, around a decade ago, a development in the technique enabled researchers to identify the presence of marine lipids, and interestingly revealed 2 examples of Neolithic pots from Scotland that have been used for cooking fish, including this incomplete Hebridean Neolithic pot from Barpa Langus on North Uist. These data were obtained from a project led by Dr. Lucy Cramp. Most recently, Dr. Simon Hammond at Bristol has refined the technique yet further, enabling it to pick up evidence for cereals and differentiating between wheat and barley. His results from Hebridean Neolithic pots are so new that they haven't been published yet, but Simon has kindly allowed us to cite them, and we'll be returning to these in Lecture 3. There have also been recent developments in the methods of recording and investigating artefacts and ecofacts. And these can help us spot details that might otherwise be hard to see. One example of this is the 3D photogrammetric modelling of various Neolithic artefacts, including the carved stone balls that we shall be revisiting in Lecture 5 by the ubiquitous Hugo Anderson Weimark. You can find these on the NMS website, National Museum of Scotland website, and on Sketchfab. And you can also read Hugo's blog on his work. Meanwhile, some of you will doubtless recall the publicity surrounding the recent publication of a reflectance transformation imaging, RTI image, of a textile impression on a late Neolithic grooved ware pot from the Ness of Brodgar. This is one of several ways of exploring impressions on pottery, of which the others include taking a mould using silicone, and this shows an impression of a plant-based textile on a slightly earlier impressed ware shirt from Glenluce, and conventional photography in raking light, which here shows the impression of matting on the base of a grooved ware pot from Barnhouse. Back to RTI, there has been, or reflectance transformation imaging, there has been a whole project by Andrew Marion Jones with Marta Diaz Guardamino that has recently investigated Neolithic art using this technique, one example of which you see here. It's the exquisite mace head from Airdens in the old county of Sutherland. And you can see here how we can zoom in to inspect details relating to how the object was made and decorated. A different kind of imaging, CT scanning, has recently been applied, as we see here, to see right through a Neolithic ecofact, namely a dog coprolite. That's a turd to you and me, that's nearly 5,000 years old and which comes from the settlement of Skara Brae on Orkney. This is being created at Edinburgh University by Elsa Panciaroli, and it is veritably a case of poetry in motion. Boom, boom. The various chunks of chewed up bone that had passed through the dog's gut have been separated out and coloured in by Dr. Andrei Romaniuk, also of Edinburgh University. And he's also revealed that Neolithic dogs at Skara Brae ate the remains of sheep and also of the Orkney vole, a critter to whom we shall be returning over the course of these lectures. Furthermore, for fans of coprolites the world over, you will be pleased to hear that, thanks to the discipline of coprology, André has been able to work out precisely where in the stream of turdage this particular dod had been located. Fabulous research. And as I always say as I show this rotating image, you may not be able to polish a turd, but you can roll it in glitter. I digress. Let's stay for a moment with animal and human remains. The various advantages in osteology allow us, for example, to recognise features such as this blunt force trauma on a Neolithic human skull from Cooeen Passage Tomb. This person was killed by a blow to the head with something that could have been a mace head, like the one here, or perhaps even a carved stone ball. The technique of zooms, that is zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, which analyses collagen sequences, enables us to identify species from small or otherwise undiagnostic fragments of bone. And it succeeded in differentiating human from seal and pig bone among the late Mesolithic finds from the shell middens on Oronsay. And it was also applied to the Skara Brae coprolite. Meanwhile, recent research by Dr. Nicholas Stewart and colleagues enables us to determine the sex of an individual through peptide analysis of tooth enamel. And this is a very useful technique in cases where the sexing of the remains through DNA or osteology is not possible or successful. But it is isotope and DNA analysis of both humans and animals that has really been hitting the headlines of late. To cut a long story short, carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone and dentine collagen can inform on what that person or animal's diet had been, while strontium and oxygen isotopes in the enamel and dentine of molar teeth can indicate mobility, showing where a person or animal had been brought up, whether it's locally or not. Basically, the enamel in the second permanent molar and in the second premolar teeth forms in your jaw between the ages of 2.5 and around 8, and it takes in the geochemical signature of the groundwater where you lived. By comparing those values with a detailed biosphere map, such as this one you see for strontium in Britain, it's possible to see whether that person or animal grew up in the same area as where they died. Strontium and oxygen isotope values can also inform us on diet. Sulfur isotope analysis is also increasingly being used, adding further information on diet and mobility. When used together, this suite of analyses offers a powerful tool. Isotope models of mobility are at a relatively early stage for Scottish Neolithic human remains, but this current major international project, the Passage Tomb Project, funded by the Irish Research Council and led by Dr. Jessica Smith, is set to provide valuable information on both mobility and diet for both humans and animals in Neolithic Orkney. It will compare these results with those obtained for Ireland and Wales. And this project also feeds into a broader international research initiative called Boyne to Brodgar. There is a longer history of dietary analysis on human remains in Scotland using carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis that goes back around 20 years, starting with this research by Rick Schulting and Mike Richards that showed that Scotland's early Neolithic farmers, in stark contrast to the Mesolithic inhabitants of Scotland, did not eat marine resources such as fish, or if they did, it was to such a minor extent as not to show up in their collagen. We should be revisiting the question of diet and the debate that surrounds it in the next 2 lectures. As regards animal isotope research, I'm sure that many of you will be aware of the remarkable recent claim by Richard Madgwick and colleagues that around 2600 BC, cattle and pigs were being driven down from Scotland, and I don't mean in cattle trucks, as well as coming from other parts of Britain, to be consumed at feasts at Durrington Walls near Stonehenge, over 300 kilometres away. This claim was made on the basis of strontium isotope ratios, and it got caught up with the argument that the spread of grooved-ware pottery and associated practices had united Britain in an insular, inward-looking culture. As a result, the newspapers and social media duly went balmy, and groups from the far right welcomed these findings enthusiastically. And as some of you will be aware, this whole argument has been given what can only be described as a thorough pasting by Gordon Berkeley and Kenny Brophy, with some justification. It has to be said. Indeed, the addition of more recently obtained data relating to the oxygen isotope research has led to the quiet abandonment of the Scottish cows and pigs idea. That's not to say that isotope results cannot be trusted, and it's not to deny that animals were being brought in from various directions and distances for the Durrington Walls feasts. Only that, as with so much scientific data, they need to be interpreted and communicated with great care. And, to be fair to the original authors, the note of caution that they had sounded all along got drowned out in the ensuing brouhaha. Equally high profile and equally hotly debated are the results of DNA analysis on Neolithic and Mesolithic people in Scotland and elsewhere. DNA has been hailed by Professor Christian Christiansen as the 3rd great revolution in archaeology because of its power to inform on ancestry, movement, and the genetic makeup of populations. And thanks to massive technical improvements over the past decade, we can now get total genome information relatively quickly and cheaply. Over 100 samples of Neolithic human remains from Scotland have now been DNA analysed, and the results are spectacular, particularly apropos the debate about the Mesolithic and Neolithic transition. 3 separate studies have revealed that the earliest farmers arrived here from the continent, and they had a major genetic impact on the indigenous population, whose genetic signature virtually disappeared. As I shall attempt to show later, this puts the nail in the coffin of the hypothesis that it was the indigenous Mesolithic people in Britain who were the prime movers of the change of lifestyle to farming. It goes without saying that the interpretation of DNA data has occasioned major debates, both among archaeologists and between archaeologists and geneticists, with some archaeologists accusing geneticists of returning to an old-fashioned culture-historical view of the past, in which change is always interpreted in terms of the arrival of new people. Similarly, the impossibility of putting a firm figure on the number of Neolithic immigrants has made some people question the claims for a massive migration from the continent. But essentially, genes don't lie. Immigration to Britain from the continent between around 4,100 and 3,800 BC is a fact, and enough people came over for a single early Neolithic cemetery in Rascoli Cave in Oban to show no signs of interrelatedness between the people buried there. We'll be returning to DNA in subsequent lectures, but for now, I would urge you to read an excellent article about the need for dialogue, respect, and mutual understanding between archaeologists and geneticists by the brilliant Dr. Tom Booth of the Crick Institute. This sums up the issues better than anything else I've read. And it's not just Neolithic humans that have been subjected to DNA analysis. It's also been applied to cattle, sheep, deer, Orkney voles, cereals, and even dogs, as we'll hear about later. And I should add that the image of a dog that you see here from Coeen Passage Tomb is a world first, as it's the first time a facial reconstruction has been attempted for a dog. It was done for Historic Environment Scotland, and thanks to COVID-19, we're actually still waiting for the results of the DNA to come through to check whether details such as eye and fur colour are correct. But the physiognomy is fine. And incidentally, this image replaces a previous and considerably less accurate picture that adorned the visitor panel at Coeen. Before concluding this review of our approaches to exploring Neolithic Scotland, I just want to highlight two further pieces of work that help to shape our understanding of what types of site do belong to the Neolithic period and what types of site do not. Starting with the latter, a series of excavations undertaken by Professor Richard Bradley over the past quarter century or so has targeted specific monument types in Scotland that had traditionally been assumed to be of Neolithic date, starting with the clava cairns around Inverness, then proceeding to recumbent stone circles, other stone circles and small henges, by which is meant small circular or oval earthwork monuments featuring a concentric bank and internal ditch. Professor Bradley found that all the monuments that he excavated were in fact later than the Neolithic, with the clava cairns and recumbent stone circles dating to the Chalcolithic to early Bronze Age, and with the small henges ranging in date from the early to Middle Bronze Age. Indeed, his work has made us reevaluate the whole notion of the henge and the stone circle as structurally or chronologically homogeneous monument types, since it's clear that they both span an enormous time range. In Scotland, the earliest examples of both henges and stone circles date to around 3000 or 2900 BC, while the latest mini-henges were built about 1500 BC, and the latest stone circles are probably of early first millennium date. The indefatigable Professor Bradley, has also made an immense contribution to our understanding of rock art in Scotland and elsewhere, through excavation and survey, examining its landscape setting, its orientation, and its connections with similar art elsewhere along Europe's Atlantic facade. His latest thoughts on Atlantic rock art have just been published. Rock art is a phenomenon that had traditionally been assumed to be of Bronze Age date, but which now seems more likely to date, most probably to the late Neolithic period. We'll be returning to the question of its date and significance in Lecture 6. Professor Bradley's rock art work is being complemented by that of a major current programme of photogrammetric recording called Scotland's Rock Art Project, or SCRAP for short, directed by Dr. Tertia Barnett. In its first 4 years, this project has increased the number of validated examples of rock art by about 500 to 3,250, and it has confirmed its uneven distribution across Scotland. Analysis of the motifs and compositions once again confirms the close similarities with other Atlantic rock art that has been studied in detail by team member Dr. Joanna Valdez-Tullet. And so, to draw this first lecture to a close, I think we can say that we are infinitely better equipped than Alexander Henry Rind to understand the people whose remains and places of burial he dug up back in 1853, and to understand the world of Scotland's first farmers. Indeed, so much work has been carried out that we are now in danger of drowning in a sea of information, and we find ourselves having to become familiar with a vast range of scientific techniques and specialist publications in order to debate the interpretation of these data in an informed way. Our task of creating a coherent narrative is beset by competing theories at every turn, some of them well-informed, others much less so. But this series of lectures will attempt to create some coherent narratives, and in doing so, it will complement and enhance the work already done by the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, SCARF for short, and by the several regional spin-offs that it has sparked. Our next lecture will deal with our big picture for the Scottish Neolithic and with filling in some of the regional narratives. At this stage of the Rinds, it's normal for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to host a wine reception. And while that's obviously not possible this year, I encourage you to reward yourselves with a glass, cup or carinated bowl of what you fancy. Thanks for listening and sláinte.